Hi, friends. How are you doing today? I hope you're all having the day that you deserve. My name is Carly Ramsey, and this is the Serial Zodiac. Hello. In today's episode, we will be talking about Capricorns, specifically one Capricorn named Harold Shipman. Now, Harold was born in Nottingham, England on January 14th, 1946. He was known as Harold Frederick Shipman, and he was born to Vera Britton and Harold Frederick Shipman. Harold, simply known as Fred, was born the middle child into a working class family, and he was the favorite child of his mother. His mother, Vera, was known to be very domineering, and she instilled an early sense of superiority in him. Now, this God complex that he had, it would go on to ruin most of his later adolescent relationships. So, during most of his teen years, he was very isolated and he had very few to no friends. Now, at the age of 15, Fred's mother would be diagnosed with terminal lung cancer on Christmas Eve in 1961. Up until this point, Fred had had a very normal childhood. Just 2 years after her diagnosis in 1963, while Fred was only at the age of 17, his mother would sadly pass away. And while she was dying in the hospital, Fred would observe how the doctors would administer her morphine to comfort her. Now, experts would later speculate that this was the moment that inspired his killing spree. And honestly, I would say I agree because after this, he was devastated by his mother's death, of course, but after this point, he was very determined to go to medical school. He was actually later on admitted into Leeds University Medical School for training. And 2 years later, having failed his entry exam the first time before serving his hospital internship. At the age of 19, Harold would go on to meet his future wife, Primrose. They were married when she was 17 years old and 5 months pregnant. And by 1974, Harold would be a father of two, and he was working for a medical practice in Todmorden, Yorkshire. Now, initially, he thrived as a family practitioner, but this was before he allegedly, and I use that term loosely, became addicted to the painkiller permethazine. He was actually caught forging prescriptions for the drug in large amounts, and he was forced to leave his practice in 1975. And at this time, he was ordered by the courts to go to a drug rehab program, and he received a small fine of £600 for the forgery. So they actually ended up not taking his medical license. They just ended up giving him a warning, which you have a doctor forging large amounts of painkillers. And I mean, like, these amounts were large enough to have unalived like multiple people. So I mean, you can't I feel like me personally, I feel like you just kind of can't be like, "Oh yeah, like he's taking those all by himself." He would be dead if he took all of those. So I mean, like, I guess I don't really know what happened here. They didn't really explain, but I guess like they never found the other painkillers or they didn't go back and get the other painkillers. But anyway, Harold is now in possession of a hefty amount of painkillers. And he was caught and they sent him to drug rehab because they were like, hey, you're taking all these drugs. This was actually his first run in with getting in trouble with his medical practice. But that did not seem to stop Mr. Fred. He seemed to get back on his feet very quickly because in 1977, he returned to medical practice at Donnybrook Medical Center in Hyde. And this is actually where he would spend the next 15 years practicing medicine. During that 15 years, Harold would integrate himself as a hardworking doctor who wanted to be trusted by patients and colleagues. But he still did build a reputation for being very arrogant. During his 15-year stay, his actions attracted little attention from the other professionals. And in 1933, Harold would go on to open his own practice. Only in March of 1998, after noticing a high death rate among Harold's patients, was Harold reported to the police, while another general practitioner also informed the Medical Defense Union, the same union that let him off with a warning. However, police closed the investigation after failing to check his criminal records and finding insufficient evidence. Had they checked his criminal records, they would have seen when he had to go to drug rehab for his alleged addiction. And I feel like that personally would have raised a few red flags, but who am I to judge? Maybe they felt as if they were doing their due diligence, but just a simple criminal background check, or a just a talk with defense the medical defense union could have stopped him right then and there, but they didn't do their due diligence. So Harold's method of murder was very consistent. He would give his patients a swift injection of dim- oh my gosh, you guys, I can't pronounce words. Dimethorphan. I'm so dumb. Diamorphine. And diamorphine is essentially a pharmaceutical heroin. And when he would inject them with his diamorphine, he would basically subtly hint to the families, once his patient had expired, that they should get cremated, because cremation, you're never going to be able to exhume that body. So it was actually around this time when police kind of started doing a little bit more investigating into Shipman. And with this investigating, they found out that not only was he kind of like convincing these patients' families to just cremate them, but he was also actually altering the records of his patients to corroborate their causes of deaths. So at this point, Shipman's still really like putting on face. Like he's like putting on that he's this caring family doctor and he would never do anything to hurt these people's parents, mothers, daughters, dads. But at this point, it's like nearly impossible to kind of establish when he actually started killing his patients and how many people up to this point had exactly died from his hands. Actually, the fact of the matter is that at this point, he was actually denying all charges that he did and actually did nothing to help the authorities. So his killing spree was only really brought to an end thanks to the determination of one amazing lady, Angela Woodruff. So, Angela is actually the daughter of one of his last victims, and she just simply refused to kind of accept the explanations that he had given her for her mother's death. So her mother, being Kathleen Grundy, her mother was very wealthy and she was very active for an 81-year-old. So Kathleen was a widow and she was found dead in her home on June 24th, 1998, after a visit by Harold. So Harold had actually told Angela that an autopsy wasn't necessary and that Kathleen had been buried in accordance with her daughter's wishes. So Kathleen Kathleen's daughter, Angela, was actually a lawyer, and this would kind of turn out to be Harold's downfall. And so Kathleen's daughter Angela had actually always taken care of her mother's affairs. So imagine the surprise of Angela when she finds out after her mom dies that her mother has a second will. And guess who in this second will that almost all of her mother's belongings and estate are being left to? Yep, you guessed it, Dr. Shipman. Like, dude, you could have been a little bit more careful. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not trying to tell you, like, I'm not trying to help you out or anything, but like, maybe you should have made sure she didn't have any children. Or, like, even if she did have children, that, I mean, her children weren't lawyers. Like, at that point, he's like, that's just, I don't know. So, she is at this point convinced that this second will had to have been forged and that Harold had to have killed her mother. So forging the will would benefit from her passing had Dr. Shipman actually forged it. So at this point, Angela was contacting the police and she gets in touch with Detective Superintendent Bernard. And after giving him all the facts, he comes to the same conclusion as Angela, that that will have been forged to gain her mother's wealth, and it was most likely forged by Dr. Shipman. So what they did was they exhumed Kathleen's body, and a postmortem autopsy revealed that Kathleen had actually died from an overdose of morphine, which was administered within 3 hours of her death. Now, this was crucial because this was exactly the time at which Dr. Shipman had visited her home. So at this point, they kind of had enough evidence to get a warrant and go and actually raid Harold's house. So when they raided his house, they obtained medical records, they obtained a somewhat odd collection of jewelry, and they actually obtained an old typewriter, which was proved to be what he had used to actually forge the fake will of Catherine. So, from the medical records that they had seized, the police quickly noticed that this wasn't just like a one off murder, that this would extend much further than that. And it was decided that priority would be given to the deaths that would be the most productive to look into, i.e., the victims that had not been cremated. And the ones who had died after being visited at home by Harold. So, a large number of patients that Harold had, he had actually urged their families to cremate them. So, he would also stress that there was no other investigation needed to be, there was no need for any other investigation to be looked into their deaths. And even when their relatives would kind of question, like, hey, well, like, I didn't even know that my family member had this disease that you're talking about, or like this medical condition, he would actually provide them with medical notes that corroborated his cause of death. So that was him trying to cover up his steps. So police discovered that most of the time when Harold will alter these medical notes, he would do so actually right after he had murdered his victims, to make sure that his account matched up with the historical records. So he wouldn't like go in and pre-alter the records. He would wait until he actually killed the victim, and then he would go in from there and alter his medical records, their medical records. So, what Shipman actually didn't think about was that every alteration of the records, there was a timestamp made by the computer, which would eventually enable the police to figure out exactly which records had been changed. So, after an extensive investigation, which included several autopsies and exhumations, the police ended up charging Harold with 15 individual counts of murder on September 7th of 1998 and one count of forgery. Shipman's trial started on October 5th of 1999 at Preston Crown Court. Attempts by his attorneys to have Shipman tried in three phases. For example, cases with physical evidence, cases without, and then Angela's mother's case, Kathleen, where the forgery differentiated it from others, as well as having damned evidence relating to Harold's fraudulent accumulation of morphine and other drugs, were all thrown out, and the trial continued on for the 16 charges included in the indictment. So the prosecution was working to kind of prove that Harold had killed the 15 patients because he enjoyed exercising control over life and death, and dismissed any claims that he had been acting with compassion, as a single one of the victims were suffering not a single one of the victims were suffering from any terminal illnesses. So none of his victims were actually sick or suffering from any terminal illnesses. He was just giving them morphine just because he liked to watch them have morphine, essentially. That's not creepy at all. So during Shipman's trial, a pathologist actually led the court through all of the postmortem findings, where in most cases, morphine toxicity was the cause of death. They also looked at the fingerprint analysis of the forged will, which showed that Kathleen had actually never handled the will, and her signature was dismissed through a handwriting expert as a forgery. A computer analyst also testified how Shipman had changed the computer records to add symptoms that his dead patients had never had. And most of the time, the changes were made within hours of their deaths. So, as this trial moved on into the victims and the accounts of their relatives, the pattern of Shipman's actions became clear. He had a lack of compassion and a disregard for the relatives, and a reluctance to attempt resuscitation were bad enough. But another fraud was actually brought to light during this trial. He would often pretend to call the emergency services when around attending relatives. Then he'd cancel the call when his patient was found dead. So telephone records actually show that no calls were actually ever made while he was basically just pretending to call the police. So finally, in the trial, they had released the evidence of drug hoarding. So if you think back to kind of the beginning, whenever he was actually one of his first crimes actually was hoarding basically a morphine drug, a painkiller, and he was just hoarding it for no reason. They thought he was a drug addict, but turns out he may not have been. So he would prescribe morphine to patients who didn't need it and overprescribe it to those who did, as well as proof of his visits to their homes of the recently deceased to collect the drugs that they hadn't used in order to dispose of them. So he was overprescribing morphine again. He had already gotten in trouble for this once, and he was then basically going to the patients' houses after they died and was like, this is mine, let me pick this back up, they didn't use it, I'm gonna dispose of it. So remember when I said that Shipman's mother kind of created this sense of superiority in him? Well, that is exactly how he acted throughout his whole entire trial. And it didn't really help his attorneys paint a picture of the dedicated healthcare professional. So they tried to, but he was literally too arrogant to to care about how he was portrayed. He just, like, that's crazy. Like, they're trying to help you out and you're just like, "No, no." Wild. So, it was also the fact that he was constantly changing his story when he would get caught in lies, and none of that did anything to really make the jury like him. So, after the judge's summation to caution the jury that nobody had actually seen Shipman kill any of his patients, the jury was sufficiently convinced by the testimonies and evidence, and they came back with a unanimous guilty verdict on all charges on January 31st of 2000. Shipman was given 15 life sentences for the murders and 4 years for the forgery, which commuted to a whole life sentence, which removed any chance of parole, and he was incarcerated. So, after his incarceration, a doctor had the idea to kind of have a deeper look into his patient history. And through the University of Leicester, Professor Richard performed a clinical audit and he examined the number and pattern of the deaths in Harold's practice and compared them to other practitioners. And the audit actually discovered that the rates of death amongst Harold's elderly patients were significantly higher, and they actually kind of clustered around certain times of the day, and that Harold had actually been present in a disproportionately high number of cases. The audit actually estimated that he may have been responsible for the deaths of around 236 patients over a 24-year period. Like, once again, 236 murders over the span of 2 years. When did you have time to spend time with your family when you're murdering people like literally every other day? I don't get it. So now at this point, Shipman has life in prison. They've figured out that he has essentially been killing people for upwards of 2 years, maybe even longer. And Shipman decides he's not staying in prison. So Shipman actually dies by suicide. He actually hung himself in his cell at the HM prison in Wakefield, West Yorkshire on January 13th, 2004, which was one day before his 58th birthday. Um, yeah, I guess he just decided he wanted to go out on his own terms. So that is Harold Shipman. He's an insane doctor who murdered all of his patients. Um, yeah, I mean, there's there's really nothing else to say about that. Like, Harold lived a long, horrific life. I don't know. I don't even know what to say. Um, I guess tell me who you guys want me to cover next week, and I'll be here for you. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my podcast. Um, I will be here for you on Thursdays, so I'm super excited. And yeah, I'm going to miss you guys and see you on Thursday. Bye. Hi, friends. How are you doing today? I hope that you are all having the day that you deserve. My name is Carly Ramsey, and this is the Serial Zodiac.